So we're very fortunate to have Clara with us today to give a keynote speech. Clara is Principal Policy Advisor within the ICO's technology team, which aims to shape the future privacy, data, and technology landscape. Her focus is on the interplay between UK data protection law and technology, particularly on anonymization, one of those privacy-enhancing technologies that's often been derided, but it still remains effective at times. She looks at research of data for research and frictionless technologies. Clara's work includes leading the ICO's guidance on biometric data, very significant and pertinent problem at the moment, and is currently in development. Prior to joining the ICO, Clara worked as a solicitor in the data protection team of an international law firm, and she has also spent time as a secondee in the ICO's policy legal team and as the European legal counsel at a large pharmaceutical company. I mentioned Slido before. Clara will be using Slido and having audience participation, so please do make sure you've got Slido open either in the room or online. But without further ado, I have the opportunity to introduce Clara. Clara.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. So my name is Clara Nevola and I'm from the Information Commissioner's Office, and as Custom mentioned, before I get started with my talk, I'd like to just ask you a quick question. So my talk has a number of interactive questions. There's absolutely no obligation to participate. Your participation won't be recorded, but I would use the aggregate results for my policy development work. So if you contribute, I'll be grateful, but if you don't worry. So first, hopefully easy question. There's no wrong answers. It's just for me to get a sense of who I'm speaking to. Oh, sorry. So the questions should be live. Okay, so it looks like quite a few of you know what the ICO is, which is great. It's very nice to be amongst friends. And for those of you who don't, well, you will by the end of this. So the Information Commissioner's Office, which is also called the ICO, we're the UK independent regulator for data protection and information rights. We're independent of government, but we're publicly funded. And we produce guidance on data protection law and freedom of information law. We provide advice and support for both organisations and members of the public. We engage with government, and we take enforcement action against organisations that do not comply with data protection law. And within the ICO, I'm part of the technology team. Our role is to anticipate, understand, and shape how emerging technology and innovation impacts people and society. And within our team, we're working on a number of strands. So we work on advertising technologies and the Internet of Things. We work on quite a few AI-related issues, so AI and fairness, AI as a service, and the privacy risks of membership inference. We work on algorithmic content recommendation, so why platforms recommend the content to you specifically. And we work on privacy in user experience design. And relevant to today's talk, where we work on biometric data and biometric technologies. So I'm going to start with a very, very, very quick introduction to data protection law in the UK. As Custom mentioned, I am a data protection lawyer, so just need to be clear, this is by no means comprehensive, but it's just to kind of get us all on the same page, figure out what we're talking about. So in the UK and in the EU and many other countries around the world, data protection law is made up of two parts. We have the prescriptive requirements, which say what you need to do and how you need to do it. So you just read that bit of a law and it tells you exactly what you need to do. You need this document needs the following things. You need to appoint this person to do this job. But the vast majority of data protection law is actually principle-based and not prescriptive. So it doesn't tell you exactly what to do and how to do it. It tells you instead the spirit in which you need to do things and the goal you need to work towards. So these principles are sort of overarching concepts that need to be built into any new technology that you're working on, or any project that you're working on, whether or not technology. And these two parts really go together. So the prescriptive requirements help you meet the principles, but they're not enough by themselves. And the prescriptive requirements are things that you would typically imagine a legal team or a compliance team to be on. That's what they do. They figure out what contracts you need, what privacy documents you need. But that's only a part of the puzzle, and you need the data protection principles to be really built in to any new project. They need to be incorporated from the start of any research project, any development project, because you can't retrofit them very easily once the technology is already out there. So before moving on, another quick question for you, which is, how much do you think data protection is relevant to your work? And again, there's no wrong answers. Oh, sorry. There we go. So I'm very happy to see how some people think about data protection all the time. Thank you, you're my people. And yeah, basically no one thinks data protection isn't relevant. That's great. So good, we're all pretty much on the same page. And for those of you who are a little bit more hesitant about data protection, I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll kind of see why privacy is at the center of any kind of research and technology that uses people's data, and certainly when we think about digital identity. So to continue this lightning tour of data protection and how it works, I'm going to briefly introduce those principles that I discussed earlier. I'm just going to give you a flavour of what each of them means, and then I'll drill into more detail on a few of them, and hopefully explain why they're relevant to the topic of this conference. So I've given them the name that they have in the law, so that should you re-encounter them, you'll know them for their names, but they have these slightly pompous names, but actually all mean quite straightforward things. So purpose limitation essentially means, what are you trying to do? And does your data contribute to that purpose? So what is your purpose? And related to that, we have lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So fairness means, is your purpose fair, and is the way you're doing it fair? And transparency means, have you explained to the people whose data you're using what you're doing with their data and why? We have data minimization. The idea here is, well, what is your goal and how much data do you need to actually achieve it? If there's data you don't need to achieve the goal, you shouldn't be processing it or collecting it. Then we have storage limitation. Again, a pretty simple concept. How long do you need to keep this data for your research? If you don't need it anymore, well, it shouldn't be there. Integrity and confidentiality, which is a security principle. So essentially, you need to assess the risk that the data has and put in place techniques to protect that data from those risks and processes to protect it. So the idea is to prevent the information being deliberately or accidentally deleted or misused. And then accuracy, which is different to statistical accuracy that some of you might work on, but it's the idea of, is the data accurate? Is it not sort of misleading or incorrect? So decisions based on historic data, for example, might be inaccurate. The concept of statistical accuracy does lead into fairness, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. And then we have accountability. I've put this little piece of puzzle to hark back to the other slide that was talking about the prescription and the principles, because essentially accountability is more of a prescriptive idea, which is you need to explain how you're meeting all those other principles, and is predominantly a role for more kind of legal teams, but for completeness, I've put it up there. So anything without this little piece of jigsaw is actually, I think, all of our roles if we're developing technology, researching technology. So that's the end of the whistle-stop tour, and we're going to drill into a little bit more detail about some of these principles. Interestingly, the palm trees were green on my laptop, but they've now gone pink. But So the way I see it, on the one side we have the words of the data protection law. What does the law say? And maybe some of you have never read the Data Protection Act or the GDPR. I would accept that, that would be fine. But actually, on the other side, we have what we're trying to do. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve a trustworthy digital ID system. So we need to implement those words into actions. We need to be able to cross this gulf between the legal principle and the technical reality. And I'm Italian, and in Italy we have this saying which is tra il dire e il fare c'è di mezzo il mare, which means between doing something, saying something and doing something, you've got the sea in the middle. But we're able to cross the sea if we know how to implement these principles in reality. So I'm hoping that I can start to show you how to do that in the next few minutes. And this quote that I have up on the slide, I think really illustrates that. Josh Lovejoy is a designer at Google, and I think this quote really captured the idea of intentionality in the design and development. So trustworthy technologies don't happen by accident. You need to intentionally go off and design them and develop them with trustworthiness at their core. So you need to think about the data protection principles to make that happen. Are they transparent? Are they fair? Are they secure? And they only happen because we care about them, because we think they're right, because we want to build them into our system. And you can't really retrofit trust. Once it's gone wrong, it's gone wrong. So you need to think about it right from the very beginning. And just because something is technically feasible doesn't mean it can and should happen. You need to really ask yourself whether the technology you're researching and developing is genuinely lawful, fair, and ultimately trustworthy. So I'm just going to drill in a bit more detail on fairness and transparency as a principle. So on the left we have the law. What does the law say? So it says that the kind of information has to be clear and concise and easy to access. And many people, when they think about how to get there, many organisations take a route that I think leads them into the high seas, which is to just put up a general privacy notice. Oh, that will do it, that's compliance. But actually it doesn't in any way meet the requirement of the principle. It's not clear, it's not concise. As users online, you've probably navigated many privacy notices, which are just long generic statements and don't tell you anything about how does this tech actually work. And I'm afraid that what I think is the good route, which again was green but now is red, but it's green as in good, you want this route, is a solution tailored to your actual technology. So it's really contextual. There is no tick box, done, we're done, we've got transparency. You need to think about what is the technology being used for and in what context, who's interacting with it, and how can you actually explain it to them when they interact with it or before. So if you think about a biometric system used in a crowded area where there's a really fast and high throughput of people, you need something very big and very clear so that you capture people's attention, and then you have a route where if people want to know more, they can find out more by investigating further. So there might be a QR code, there might be flyers, there might be members of staff available to discuss. And that will be very different to a context in which you have an IoT, which the individual interacts with directly. There's a device which maybe the information can come up on screen in various different ways. You could think about audio or visual cues that indicate whether a device is recording biometric data. And if you are going to use those cues, you need to think about, well, does the person know what these cues actually mean? So it's a bit upsetting because there's no silver bullet, there's no tried and tested technique for getting transparency done, but it means that you need to think about it from the outset so that when the technology is fully developed, the individual will understand what it's doing. And transparency, really, I think I see it as the kind of core of trustworthiness, because just because a technology is capable of being frictionless, it doesn't mean that you can sidestep transparency. So not only is this a legal duty in the UK and the EU, but it's also, I think, kind of a core element of trustworthiness. And going to be a bit cheeky, given I have an audience of researchers and expert developers, I would love to hear your suggestions of what you think makes good transparency. So what have you seen in the industry that you think works well? This might be as a user, as a consumer, or as a designer, a developer. And I will... Here it is. I think that one's live now. So it's a bit of a trickier one. If you have any ideas of something you've seen that you thought, wow, that works so well, I really understood it, or that you've developed yourself, or that you've seen another organisation do. And I can leave it open for a bit. If you have any ideas while I'm talking, you can add it on. Oh, actually, sorry, I'm getting results here. Hang on, show results. There we go. I think the metrics is a really nice idea in terms of just because you've designed it to be transparent doesn't mean it might be having the intended effect. So the audio and visual cues is an example of that, where the developer might think, oh, this flashing light is so clear. Obviously people understand it, but then if you have a metric for transparency and you do follow-up user research to see whether they're actually understanding. Disclose, yeah, I really agree with the disclosure point in that transparency is the opposite of secrecy. So you need to be really upfront with what this technology does. And if you think it does stuff that the public won't be that happy with, well, you either need to change that or you need to put it up front and center and allow them to understand it. And then trust within the infrastructure company and usage. I think I also really agree with that one, in that it needs to be a real organizational approach. Everyone needs to be on board with making technology transparent and understandable. Cool. Well, I'll move on, but feel free to keep adding more. So now going to go on to talk about fairness as a principle. Haven't got the beautiful picture of the Gulf again, but the boat indicates we're still on this journey between sort of principle and practice. And what I've got is a few ideas of how you might build fairness in. This list isn't by any means comprehensive. There are other ways to think about fairness, but it's just a sort of starting point of how could you build it in. So I would start with, is the purpose fair? So you're setting out to research or develop a particular thing, and is that thing you're trying to do you think it's fair for the people you are doing the thing to? So to think of a scenario in a recruitment context, you might have people who come in, have a tea and coffee as we were having earlier, and before they go off to do their interview and assessments. And you could have biometric systems that assess their emotions, how stressed they are, how deep their connections they are that they're making, and then you could use that data as part of the assessment process. And then you would need to ask, well, is that purpose fair? Is it fair to use people's interactions when they're having a pre-interview assessment as part of the decision whether or not to recruit them? And that links to, is the way the data is collected fair? So central to this is transparency. In this recruitment scenario, have you told people that the way you behave while you drink your coffee will be used as part of your recruitment decision? So is it transparent, but also is it in a context where it's appropriate to collect that data? And how does the biometric technology affect people? So what's the impact on people, and is the impact fair? That doesn't mean that the decision can never have a negative impact. It's just that if it does have a negative impact, it needs to be justified. You need to be using the correct data to make that decision about someone. So, for example, in a passport queue or an automatic biometric gate, at the border, it's really important for people to be who they say they are. And so it is fair, probably, for them to be rejected if the system isn't sure and to have to go through a manual verification process. While in a context where an employee cannot access their workplace and cannot start working, cannot start earning unless they are recognised, it would be less fair to them to be rejected, especially if there wasn't a fast follow-up to fix the issue. So that leads to what's the plan B, which is if the technology goes wrong and has a negative impact on someone, what can they do about it? Is there a manual process which is quick and easy to implement? Do they have another way round? Is the system sufficiently statistically accurate? So here, again, this really does link to the impact. The more severe the impact, the higher your levels of statistical accuracy should be. So in a research project where people are voluntarily participating and no decisions are being made about them, the statistical accuracy is important to the outcomes of a research, but it is more acceptable for there to be high levels of error because there is no decision being made about them. While in the context where you have, for example, an employee trying to get to work, it's very important that the statistical accuracy is high if they can't start earning unless they get in. And then we also have, very importantly, does the system avoid discrimination? So is the decision based on relevant factors or are relevant characteristics of individual affecting the outcome? So can all individuals expect the same outcome if other variables are the same? So for this, you really need to assess the default parameters that are being used in the system and whether they are truly default or whether the developer and designer has been skewed by their own experience. So many systems are not designed to be explicitly exclusionary of certain individuals, but because the defaults aren't queried from the outset, you end up with systems that are discriminatory and exclusionary of certain identities and individuals. And this goes back to the idea of intentionality. So you really need to query this. So in the biometric gate system, if you have two people of the same age, ethnicity, nationality, same lighting conditions, same posture, but different genders, are they having the same outcome? And if not, why not? And what tests are in place and mitigation measures are in place for that? So that's how you kind of think about fairness in the context of data protection. And again, I think a central part of trust. Oop. Sorry. So again, a little question for you, which is how to develop fair technologies. Yeah, so it's already live. Okay, so I've put some ideas here. They're, again, not comprehensive, not exclusive. You might have some better ideas to me, and if you do, please shout them out or raise them at the end, whatever you want. But I'd be interested to see what you think is a good idea. Maybe things that you've used yourself in your own development, or that you just think is a good plan. So at the moment, the one which is at the top is to use training data that represents the audience on which the technology will be used. That sounds so obvious and is done so rarely. And so many problems that you see kind of out in the wild are caused by this. Yeah, so I like the top one because I think it's actually the easiest one to implement and is actually done very rarely. Particularly in contexts where you have vendors who provide digital ID systems and then they are used in a completely different context with no thought about what was this developed for and is it being used for the same reason. Sorry, I don't have the hang of the clicker. Okay, so we're going to move on to another principle and just do the same thing of kind of explaining how you would move from the principle to the practice. So that's on the left is what the law actually says, on the left of the slide, and it's that the data should be adequate and relevant to what is limited. So is this the data you actually need to fulfill your purpose? So going off into the high seas is to think about, well, what does the law say? Does the law say how much data I can use and what's the maximum amount of data I'm allowed to use? Surely the law says that, and what types of data I'm allowed to use. Actually, the law doesn't say any of that, it just says you need to decide. So the main thing to think about is what data do you actually need to achieve this purpose? Anything that isn't within that is not data you should have. Really, obviously, extremely context dependent, but it's the kind of thing you would do at the very beginning of a project. The next thing to think about is anonymization. So do you need real personal data, or will it work the same if you have anonymous data? So in a model training system, you might be okay with synthetic data, at least in the early phases, or you might be able to anonymize it in other methods. So if you do need personal data, you could think about, is pseudonymous data okay? So pseudonymous is sometimes called de-identified, and it's basically the idea of splitting the data into the parts that identify someone and the parts that don't, and keeping them separate so that if needs be, you can re-identify someone later, but in the meantime, you use the data that doesn't identify them. So things like key coding or hashing. And also to think about is what happens to the data once you've achieved your goal. So does it still need to be kept on the system? Do you need it for further research? If so, are you still sure that that further purpose is still fair and transparent? There's a slight problem with this slide as well as the colours, so sorry about that. The text on the top there is wrong. That's all the principles we have left, we have time for. So my key message really is that data protection and trust, as we envisage it at the ICO, is really not a tick box exercise. So there's no way to get a rubber stamp to tell you, yes, something is privacy compliant. Really, you need to build it into the conception of the research project and the development of a technology and of a product, and you need to keep an eye on it throughout the whole life cycle of a technology. And the principles need to be kind of at the heart of what you're doing, and it's only you, the individuals involved in the research and the development, that can make that happen. We do have more resources coming on this soon from the ICO. So we are developing guidance, as Carsten mentioned, which will be live next year and will be open for consultation once it is. We also have a series of workshops for organisations that use or develop biometric technologies, including digital IDs. So if that's something you're interested to carry on the conversation, please do sign up to apply. We also have an email address, so if you think of anything you want to ask me or talk to me about later on after today, please feel free to email. And lastly, if you really like this, you can actually be my colleague. So I work with quite a few people who are technologists who join from academia or from industry, and we're looking for people with expertise on the areas that I've listed in the panel. So if you or people you know are interested in working with the regulator or for the regulator, you can either come and work as an employee, or you can also be a secondee where you stay within your organisation but you come and work with us for a period of time. So if that's of interest, please do get in touch. And I think we have time for a few questions, so there you go.
I think I'll take a microphone. I think hopefully it's turned on so you can hear me online. So thanks very much for a really interesting talk. So we've got some questions. There's a couple of questions about data accuracy, actually, so I'm going to ask you about that. Would you agree that data accuracy includes the quality of biometric samples? Oh, it's not on. Yeah, it's this one here that you can see from Dan Backenheimer, who's works a lot in biometrics, part of the Trustworthy Digital Identity Interest Group, and is watching online. I guess I know him and he's not in the room. So
yeah, I would definitely agree that the quality of the sample is an important part of accuracy. So if you have images or templates that are low quality, that there's a high error rate, that data is not accurate of that person. So if you can have multiple identifications based on one person, your data is probably not accurate enough for the decision you're trying to make, specifically in the context of unique identification. So
okay, thank you. And there's one I'd like to ask about definition. So the two things that came up on definition. So one person is how is fairness defined, and do you formally define concise, easily accessible? Because we know these are principles and they're a good thing to have, but there are actually, the metrics thing was for me before, there are metrics for how readable something is, for example. Do you formally define that in your work, and do you formally define fairness? So
it's not defined in the actual legal text. Part of the role of the regulator of the ICO is to interpret and explain what the law means. So we have guidance on what fairness means. We have specific guidance on what fairness in AI means, so the underpinning of many of these technologies we're talking about. And we have guidance on transparency. So we don't have a definition. We don't have a metric in the sense of a numerical metric, but that is something that maybe would be interesting to explore further in our work. And so we have plenty of guidance that you can read. It's not defined in the law because it is so context dependent of, does this person understand what's going on?
Yeah, and so in that way, do you point to a lot of further guidance that you've written yourself? Because, as I say, for easily readable, it's not necessarily that you make a metric to say, this is, if you don't conform to this, you're not within regulation, but more so that people that are developing, I sometimes find that people just don't understand some aspects of ethics, for example, or some aspects of fairness. and therefore might be a little lost. And of course, you'll provide some guidance to that, but do you point people to other areas? How does somebody who's developing really almost work with the regulator, rather than think, okay, the regulator's informing what I must do, I must have compliance, but really to try and get that conversation? Because I think if that happens, you just industry and we'll move on and work together.
So in terms of working together, we're really open at the ICO wanting to work with industry and academia. So we have numerous streams by which, instead of just waiting to find out whether you've done it wrong in case you get a fine, we actually do it the other way around, which is you come and talk to us about your ideas, your technologies and your products, and we kind of talk you through how you would actually achieve transparency or fairness. So we have this system called the Sandbox, where quite a few biometric providers have come through the Sandbox, and essentially it's a co-development with the ICO and that company. And we have a new service coming called iAdvice, which is a similar version but a bit more light touch, because instead of committing months to working with the ICO, you commit kind of a lower time period. In terms of our guidance is not sector specific. So our guidance on transparency is for the whole economy, and so we don't have specific biometric measures, but that's something I'm working on at the moment and that will be live next year. So maybe we should chat over lunch about what kind of metrics we should be looking at in terms of fairness and transparency.
Definitely. Thank you. We've got some great questions on the board, but we don't have time, so I apologise to Ura and Mohsen and the anonymous one, but hopefully we'll get some time to answer that in different means. But can we just thank Clara again for a really interesting, engaging talk?